does it mean to get stoned or when you're stoned? And I had to think about that because people really hadn't asked me it quite that way before. And I said, good question, but if being stoned is a change of consciousness and we don't really understand the magic spark of consciousness, I think we have to leave that to the poets like Michael Pollan with that statement. So there have been the fathers, and I'm going to use that word just because that's how they're generally regarded. I'm sure women had pivotal roles, but these four cultures, Chinese, Egyptians, India, and Greece, the fathers of medicine were all known to have written about cannabis because they were acknowledged as the fathers in their individual cultures because they documented their findings. That's really why they're regarded historically as they are. So I want to just point out that even before these times, in prehistoric times, you would have always had somebody in a tribe of early humans, and probably even before agriculture was part of cultures. And that individual would be trusted almost as a healer because they knew what plants could hurt you and what plants might help you. And so they not only knew those secrets, but they had to themselves be pretty good at sustaining those plants, or they would have lost their formulary. And then they're not regarded as a good healer, nor as a plant custodian. So maybe in some ways, I'm combinations of that. Sustaining plants is critically important. And this might be an Eastern healer's ancient wisdom. It was shared generationally to ensure health and survival. Why not? I mean, it's critical information historically in primitive times. So getting more into modern times for how misinformation, and we're living into times now where that's big, but it's nothing new. And in this sense, I want to show you two classical pictures. On the left is the opium poppy. On the right is the willow tree. And none other than Bayer, from Bayer aspirin fame, has been dealing with these two plants for 150 years. And the point I'm going to bring out here is that heroin was first synthesized in 1874 and advertised as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, which was known even before then. And during 15 years, until it was taken off the market, it was sold, even including to children, as a cough suppressant. It works great as a cough suppressant, but obviously it's much more addictive than morphine. So hence is the marketing, but the point of the year that it was taken out of circulation by Bayer is because now you had something else. You had aspirin, again, Bayer, and that in the latest 1800s, it patented its new brand of aspirin, safe and effective, from the bark of the natural willow tree. Its patent was set to expire in the 1930s, and that's when Bayer advanced aspirin's generic marketing to compete with other analgesics, including cannabis, which became illegal through its really first prohibition going back to 1937 with something called the Marijuana Tax Act that made it too expensive for people to get. So moving on then, in the mid-1940s, finally someone was recognized, in this case, Sir Robert Robinson, a British chemist, for his work with alkaloid chemicals. We'll talk about what alkaloids are in a minute, because most pharmaceuticals from plants are using alkaloid chemicals that the plant has manufactured in many ways to either defend itself from herbivore predators, they taste bitter, alkaloids, or sometimes to change the sensorum or other behaviors of those animals that might be eating it. I'm not talking only humans, but in this case, Robert Robinson, back in the turn of the last century, did work on cocaine and on morphine. He's actually found for cocaine the original precursors to cocaine. And by the way, cocaine is not a prohibited substance in the in DEA, for the Drug Enforcement Administration, because the liquid form of it is used to soak pledgets for ear, nose, and throat surgery, because as a local anesthetic, which cocaine is, it's the only local anesthetic we use that also is a vasoconstrictor. So at the same time, it doesn't require the need of adding, say, adrenaline to it like the dentists use. And anybody who's ever had some dental work and had a little adrenaline that gets into your bloodstream, it's a memorable event. Really does act strongly with the heart. So I mentioned alkaloid chemistry, but the father of cannabinoid medicine worked particularly with lipid chemistry. Cannabis is a lipid, it's a fat. And so the research that Professor Meshulam did, which was at Hebrew University for most of his career, actually started back in the 1960s, because his same lab, going way back then, was the first to identify not only delta-9 THC as being that intoxicating substance in cannabis, but he also identified the biosynthetic pathway that the plant uses in manufacturing those cannabinoids, and not only THC, but also CBD. However, the real important discovery waited 30 years longer. And it's only in the early 1990s, after I'm already in practice as an anesthesiologist, that this is the sentinel event, the discovery of the body's own ligands. There's two of them, that called anandamide and 2-AG, that cannabis or THC is mimicking. It's not the other way around. And in order to have a good understanding of what cannabis does, you really have to first have a biological context in which to interpret what limited evidence-based data there may be for delta-9 THC. And this is what gives it to you, knowing the mechanism of action on how natural cannabinoids work, what their purpose is. And that was also through the same lab of Professor Meshulam. In 2016, I visited with him there. I've seen him here at Harvard. We've had some engaging conversations. Unfortunately, he passed away at 92 years old this past March. And I firmly believe that this was not a controversial subject. He would have already received the Nobel Prize with his life's work, but such is the nature of these things, and these awards for Nobel are not awarded posthumously. So I'm just bringing this up because he's had a tremendous influence on anybody who understands cannabis and the cannabinoid and endocannabinoid receptor system today. So where does that bring us from cannabis? Let's just jump right to mushrooms. Anybody know what those would be on your left? Hint, they're not seeds. Anybody? Okay, well, they're spores. Mushrooms and ferns are actually propagated by microscopic tiny little spores. And those are just blown up 20 micron size things to where you can actually see them. The mushrooms itself are depicted in the middle. And on the right there, you may see it's sitting in sort of a pile of something dark. Well, it actually grows very well in cow pastures. And you know what's in cow pastures, cow patties. And in fact, this is a picture from Cuba. And that's why the name of the fungi, psilocybin cubensis, refers to not the shape cube, but the country Cuba. And the University of Miami, where I'm a professor of anesthesiology, our mascot is the ibis. It's that bird that you see in the football games. And ibises, when they walk through these fields, pick up on their feet some of the spores and actually spread those mushrooms around. They don't seem to get psychedelic experiences from it, but humans have long understood that it has a psychedelic impact. The difference between psychedelics, though, and cannabis is I can't tell you the mechanism of action for these. So I'm asked when I give talks, what do I think about it? And I kind of defer. I can tell you that its impact on depression lasts far longer than you could detect this drug in a person. And that's the fascinating part of it. On pain and depression, psilocybin seems to have an enduring effect that, if I'm going to put it in computer terms, those of you who remember the old days with computers where the only way to make it work properly again were to do a hard reset, at least conceptually, that's sort of how I think it's working. But let's just say that psilocybin does work between three key neurotransmitters, certainly dopamine, probably serotonin, and as a third, probably oxytocin too. And so there's some fascinating research being done with those three chemicals, especially in the midbrain, where we have all those emotions and connections of neural links that spread things through the full brain. But it's at this moment, it's nowhere near as well understood as the mechanism of action for cannabinoids. So what I try to do is I try to diffuse the questions that I get with a little humor, so bear with me. My kids tell me this is a dad joke coming up. But imagine, if you would, a moment if you had two magic mushrooms and they were each trash talking each other. What might that look like? And maybe it would be something like this. Okay. Moving right on then. I want to try to give you two take-home messages now that we're sort of more than halfway through some slides. And it's about temptations and indulgences. The choices that you get, unless you're really going to want to know if there's going to be a negative outcome at the end, sort of reminds me of the genie parable, where you get those three wishes. You know, the first two are the get yous, and then the third is the really got you one. And so what I'm careful for now is, with all of the misinformation that gets spread around about medicines and diseases, especially during COVID, science and reason really do matter. And I'm going to be coming up with that same phrase when we're concluding the talk in a few minutes. Moving on then, this is 1970. And this was a seminal moment because not only was cannabis categorized as prohibited, but now you had a whole new system for how the federal government, through the Drug Enforcement Administration, could regard substances based on a few different variables, including known uses or abuses. And with that, I'll go into the definitions a little bit, because anybody who prescribes needs to know the difference between a Schedule I prohibited substance versus controlled substances, which occupy schedules called 2, 3, 4, and 5. What I'm pointing out by wanting to show you this slide is the schema for the Controlled Substances Act was something devised largely with the control guidance between government and Big Pharma. That's why I started off showing you Bayer. Big Pharma's schema for scheduling generally is because they have several drugs lined up. So its schema is based on one molecule, generally to treat, not necessarily cure, one disease, and for one patent. That's why the one molecule model that way has been for so often how we've had drugs coming out of different controlled status for the last 50 years. This is now 53 years of this system of the Controlled Substances Act. So it's probably a good time to liken that to public health. And it's not only the last 50 years, but I want to point out this graph, which is a chart that was established, and it comes actually from 2004. But look at two ends of this chart. The one on the left is tobacco smoking, 2004, and certainly by far and large, huge difference between that and obesity in terms of the risks of the leading causes of preventable deaths, preventable being the word. And yet you look way out to the right, and the ninth position is drug abuse. Well, in the 15 years after 2004, tobacco smoking went down a lot. I mean, this is actually, in the last 15 years, that's a public health victory, folks. It really is. But at the same time, drug abuse started to go up because of lethal opioid overdoses. Now, I'm just going to show you the next 15 years from 04 right through 2019. And anybody who's been paying attention to the news during COVID, fentanyl, accidental deaths, know that this likely underestimates things. But drug abuse has moved from that ninth position, trending over these 15 years, all the way up to surpass motor vehicle collisions. And I'm not sure, but right now, if toxins could include overdose deaths from from additives to things, including fentanyl, this is truly encroaching a dramatic change in public health risk over the last 15 to 20 years. And that comes to mind then, what is and where is cannabis in this? So these are some classical pictures of plants depicted from the way you would show a plant, because it's depicted where it shows not only the flowering portions, but the seeds and the growth cycle. So cannabis sativa is regarded by both the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, for its safety and efficacy and use and abuse, compared to the scheduling from the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is really looking at risks and benefits and saying that something should be either prohibited or controlled. And the definitions for those prohibited or controlled, I'll show you in just a second. But it's not only about that. We'll go into other plants by comparison. Key here is that a Schedule I substance, by definition, has a high potential for abuse. That's the first one there. Number two is that it says no currently accepted medical use for treatment in the United States. And that's now what has been shown with evidence-based data for at least a few limited conditions to not be so. It's not so. The third may be the gotcha one, because they say a lack of accepted safety under medical supervision. Well, how closely supervised in the data that really is being accumulated with all of the 38 states now that have medical programs is fairly abysmal for reporting and looking at this really in a balanced way. But certainly the first two definitions of this, as I've shown you here, no longer apply to why cannabis should be festering as a Schedule I substance. There may be changes ahead, though, and that's what I'll show you in just a moment. So there are other drugs that I told you about before, whether opium or cocaine. They're both plant-derived substances, and I'm giving you my bias as a plantsman. Then, of course, we talked about tobacco. There's tobacco right there. And if you don't think that some other drugs are just part of culture, both chocolate and coffee, if you don't think they're habit forming or have some dopamine benefits coming out, I grow both of those in my backyard legally, but they're just part of culture. So I wanted to point that out, that just because things are part of culture, ranging from tobacco to coffee in particular, this is the way cannabis is finding its way into a niche. And by the way, tobacco and cannabis leaves have been combined for centuries. Remember, cannabis is an old world plant. It evolved on the eastern slopes of the Himalayas after the last ice ages when humans discovered it. But tobacco is a new world plant. And it had already been brought back to Europe on Columbus's second voyage. And it wasn't long before pipes in Europe had not only cannabis leaves, but tobacco in it, because the two together biochemically create a different balance. And it's also the reason, as a trivia note here, for the words blunt, spliff, and joint, which represent different combinations of tobacco and cannabis leaves. Moving on then, really nowadays, physicians in those states where it's legal, or physicians who are just looking to advance things with their patients' best interests at heart, knowing that as a physician, they should be able to have access to different medicines. It presents a dilemma, and it's the question of, should a physician offer compassionate cannabis for use as a medicine while it still remains under federal prohibition? And that question has been hammered back and forth with lawyers and doctors through a thought process called medical legal ethics. And it sounds nice when you look at what the AMA says about medical legal ethics, because it says a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements that are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Well, it sounds good, but it's very impractical if you happen to live in a state where cannabis is legal because of the state's laws, and yet you have two licenses very frequently, not only your license to practice in the state you're in, but also a DEA license that, for the purposes of cannabis, puts one license in conflict with the other. And that's where some of these challenges are coming up if you're looking at it purely on a medical legal basis. So what I've come to terms with is what I would like to approach to you is a way to look at it that is a little different view. And bioethics is a different field in ethics that evolved largely after World War II, when you had questions about the evolving science, including nuclear energy and atomic bombs, and how are we going to deal with this to reap the good from it and yet not to be stuck with the bad and ugly side? And nuclear weapons comes to mind, but so do stem cells. When Bush 1 was in office and the first stem cell research lines were being approved or validated, you had people who were saying, oh my God, we can't create Frankenstein, we shouldn't touch those. And so it took a bioethical conversation, which means that it's involving not only the lawyers and doctors, but the teachers, law enforcement, the patients themselves, clergy, everybody is part of a bioethical conversation. It's not limited to medical, legal, doctor, lawyers. And so it brings the full community into the conversation. So the following two sentences for me is what works for realizing that there is a ethical solution to the challenge above. And the first might be on the basis of how patients really do use cannabis in particular, and understanding not all pain is physical. What it says here is seeking relief from the intolerable physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms of injury and disease is instinctual, and it contributes to medicinal substances use and abuse. And so if that's from the basis or the bias of a patient, then a physician or a healer would be saying to this, the treatment of intolerable symptoms is a noble task that society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. I don't really have to think about it ethically further than that, because you got to have a moral ground from which to proceed on, especially if you're going to be doing something that our government would otherwise regard as illegal. And very often the conservative basis from organized medicine, whether it's the AOA or AMA, they do take their bully pulpit from a very conservative base. So for me, this is how I sort of diffuse their limited abilities at times to look at this outside of a medical legal context. Oops, there's the same picture I think I showed before, but that's the one I wanted to have. This is the new one. And so this is actually from 2018. This was a bill that was an agriculture bill on the federal level. It's the every few years there is a Agriculture Improvement Act, and in this particular year, cannabis, which remember, cannabis includes not only marijuana, which has the intoxicating THC, but it also includes, as a plant family, hemp. Hemp is a textile. The history of cannabis is far more extensive for its use as a textile than its use as a drug ever thought of being. Columbus's ships and riggings, the sails, they're all done with hemp. Clothing, textiles now for making concrete alternatives. Hemp is and was a product that even during World War II, the prohibition on hemp, which actually started back in 1937 with the Marijuana Tax Act, was repealed because hemp was important to the war interest during World War II. Hemp for Victory was the government's program back then. But back in 2018, then, the definition for hemp was excluded from cannabis marijuana, so that you could grow hemp in all 50 states, and you can grow it today in all 50 states. There's an unexpected or unintended side effect of that farm bill that I'm going to tell you about in just a moment, because it's produced something called Delta-8 THC. And I'm bringing this to you. This was just from a few months ago, but the DEA now is having to deal with the fact that with the federal change in agriculture, now you have all 50 states growing cannabis, but not for its use as a textile, because everybody wanted to jump on the craze of CBD. It almost was being marketed as a snake oil. And since it is an oil, it's probably an appropriate analogy of snake oil. But it's because it was becoming the new wonder drug of all the things it could do. CBD is pretty darn good for relieving anxiety and so-so for inflammation. That's my summary statement. And when I'm saying pretty good for anxiety, it's because I'm comparing it to other pharmaceutical anxiolytics. So what happened is that CBD, there was a glut within the first couple years after that 2018 Farm Bill, because everybody now and their brother-in-law are growing it in all 50 states. So now the market price for that CBD that these farmers went to because they thought they could make a huge profit, it's going down the toilet. So what you can do with CBD is you can actually subject it to an acid. This is a little chemistry thing here, but I want to tell you how this happens so you get an idea for why this is such an important issue now. And if you're not attuned to this, keep your eyes open for who's getting high on what. because Delta-8 THC is also intoxicating, but in the whole flower plant, in the whole marijuana plant, it's produced in such small levels, such small amounts, that you'd have to grow acres upon acres to make one joint. I mean, it's that rare. However, if you take CBD and you subject it to a strong acid, you can actually close one of the rings. I'm giving you the chemical thing, but you can turn it from CBD into Delta-8 THC, which is also intoxicating. Why is that a concern? Well, it's a concern because in the 50 states where hemp is legal, it means that Delta-8 THC is, well, at least semi-legal. Or you can say it is gray market instead of black market. And that's a concern because Delta-8 THC can be sold to an 11-year-old in a gas station all across the country now. And that should be a concern to you. If I only told you one thing that you need to know about cannabis and kids, is that the connections in kids' brains are not complete when they even hit 18 or 21 and they can drink booze. It's probably closer to the mid-20s. And those neural connections, those endocannabinoid guided connections in brains are represented in limited evidence-based data, but as an ability to problem solve. And kids who start smoking young, strong stuff and don't stop do show changes in IQ. And that study was done years ago in Dunedin, not Florida, Dunedin, but Dunedin, New Zealand. And that is still a very important study that, even though it's not perfect, I'd love to see more studies that look at things proactively so that if we start studying somebody now, we follow them as that study did over years of use. So the point is, we know a lot about Delta-9 THC, good and bad, because it's been looked at critically over the last 50 years because of it being prohibited. And yet we know next to nothing about Delta-8 THC. And if you think it's just one's like the other, you could be seriously fooled by that. The subtle differences of one ring closing versus another can be huge. In this case, it impacts cannabinoid receptors and fools or sort of hijacks the endocannabinoid system to allowing the user to feel high, to get a buzz. And yet it's sold, as I said, really without any guardrails, including to kids. So moving on from that slide then, this was a resolution this past summer. I know we're here in Florida and we may be backwards, but this is actually something I do feel strongly enough about to have supported this. And let's just say that the mechanism for the whereas is up top there that are in small print. Don't worry about reading them. It's just the same thing I just explained to you about how this now has been something that's brought Delta-8 THC everywhere in the country. And our Florida Medical Association supports legislative and regulatory efforts to prohibit it, as well as perhaps half of the states where it's legal now have advanced this. But we still really want the opportunity for proper scientific research, even if it means that that Delta-8 is legally accessed through the Farm Bill so that it's available to research because of having the quantities needed for effective research that you wouldn't get if you tried to derive it purely from the plant itself. So there will be some other big changes coming fairly soon, I think. And this is what I wanted to sort of conclude with this last slide before we're really wrapped up. About a month ago, the Biden administration announced that their Health and Human Services secretary had finished about a 1.5-year study of looking at medical marijuana to see, is it properly categorized as prohibited, or might, with its current research and evidence-based data, be properly better considered as a different controlled substance. And their findings were that it is more appropriately scheduled as a Schedule 3 substance. Now, I didn't tell them where to make it. This is not me. I'm giving you the report from the HHS secretary after a 1.5 years of study. The reason that's important is the announcement of just that part came out about a month or so ago. And now it has to get turned over to the Drug Enforcement Administration, sort of the judicial side of Food and Drug. No, they are not the ones who decide it, but the DEA now has it in their court, and not really court, but under their review. I'm thinking that with the 2024 elections next November, that the timing of why this was done now is not accidental. I think that they firmly expect to see a change or a disposition from the DEA coming before the next election, so it becomes an election year topic again. And I actually think that's a good thing, because federal prohibition has really stymied not only research, but access. And it's put doctors, again, right in the crosshairs of conflict because of a state license versus a federal license where it says it's illegal if the state says you can do it. So what that'll do is it'll really make 3 or 4 things quickly change. One is interstate banking. And believe me, the companies who are in this, who are multi-state operators, who are working and jumping from one state to the other to see where they can make a quick buck, they'll be able to ease up the banking restrictions. The next thing is it can be legally prescribed. Right now, even in states where it's legal, the word prescribe, which means it's a doctor's order, if you want to get in trouble, write your recommendation or your certification or whatever a given state calls it, that is not saying, then none of them say the word prescribe. Write it on a prescription pad and see if it doesn't throw up red flags for you. Right now, you cannot legally prescribe medical marijuana in any of the 50 states because of the federal guidelines on it. So what it'll do by being able to be prescribed is it will have to be taught in medical schools like all other legal prescribing drugs. I can tell you, being among the faculty at the University of Miami, that I've also served as the president of our alumni association for the medical school, along with some of the deans. And they know I'd love to get this into the curricula as far as the general subject. But they said, Jeff, if we do that, we're going to have to take other stuff out of the curricula because it's an extensive subject. And the fact is, when the students graduate, they get an MD, and I've been honored to give the oath of medicine when they get that MD, telling them right from wrong, but that's not when they actually can practice medicine. They first have to finish passing all 3 parts of their national board exams. And guess what's not asked about on national board exams? Because national or federally, it's still regarded as having no known medical use. So they're teaching in medical schools throughout the country for the performance of their students, understandably, on that board exam. And they kind of have to, because it's the biggest determinant to their rankings of medical schools, the performance of students on the board exam. So this would change all that. This would make the doctors coming out of medical schools now far more knowledgeable than most of the doctors who are peddling it today, who are a lot of times older docs who may be retired, maybe who remember it fondly from their youth. But I will say that on those grounds, on being legally prescribed, forcing it to be educated in schools, certainly interstate banking, and also it frees up what has been an extraordinarily hard way to research controlled, not controlled substances, but Schedule I substances. The difference between Schedule 1 and 2 also involves not only the banking, but the ease of research. So Schedule 3 may not seem low enough in the scheduling for some people. Some people say, oh no, it needs to be descheduled. Well, don't confuse decriminalization with, legalization. Your docs and legalization, you want to practice legal medicine, whichever state you're in. So I'm going to actually start to wrap it up when I mentioned to you about science and reason matter with this quote, and it's a take-home message. Without some common baseline of facts, without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent's making a fair point and that science and reason matter, we'll keep talking past each other, making common ground and compromise impossible. So there's that science and reason matter statement again. And so there is a place you can get some pretty good information. The answer page is run by 2 colleagues who are both anesthesiologists out of Harvard. Actually, they're at Brigham and Women's. If you're interested in things, they have a rather advanced curricula on cannabis that serves at least, I believe, 10 states now, where certain states have mandated education of their doctors that want to practice in this space. I encourage you to look over there, and I've actually contributed some things on that site as well. And that really wraps it up. Another shot of me there in the greenhouses. And if you want some questions, I guess it took about 45 minutes or a little less than that, Bill.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah. Great. As always. So can you, let's see, there's a question here. Thank you for the explanation of where Delta 8 comes from. Okay, so it's not a question. Can you give us a little bit of a summary then of you know, what, so there's a number of our number in our group besides you. There's Kent, there's Dustin Sulak, are extensively involved in cannabis to one form or another. What's your advice to those of us who are sort of on the outside looking in, as far as prescriptions, what to look for, what to be careful of, those kind? I know you touched on it, but
no, they're very good points. You know, last time when I spoke with this group, I talked more about the specific things, the evidence-based data, line item wise, and things like that. What I'd caution anybody who's listening to this to do is look at this from thinking, if you are going to try to practice, what would your ideal standard of care be? Because I will tell you that the way most physicians in states practice, it's by being careful just not to break the law. And in a given state, the laws and the rules and regulations may be very different than in another state. And in particular, in states which allow recreational use, or adult use is the euphemism there, those states pretty much have eclipsed the medical programs because the patients are just going and buying it that way. There are benefits to doing it under a physician's supervision, but as physicians, what I'd encourage you to look at would be a report that came out in early 2017. In January 2017, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine published an extensive meta-analysis, and their findings really found that cannabis was helpful for three main things, and I'm going to list a fourth now, but I'm going to break things down just in a few sentences to things that have either conclusive evidence-based data or substantial evidence-based data, not things with a moderate or low amount. So what has conclusive evidence-based data? Well, for THC, actually that fits its use for nausea and vomiting. As an antiemetic, it's been known for thousands of years, and there's enough evidence-based data. So people say, well, but there's actually a legal drug now that is a synthetic form of it called Marinol. It's on the market and you can take it for nausea and vomiting. The problem is, if you've ever seen a patient actually take Marinol, to begin with, you got to swallow it. And if you're really throwing up a lot, that's hard in of itself. The next thing about Marinol, though, is it's only THC. And in the balanced cannabis plant, actually, mostly that CBD that I said relieves anxiety, also relieves the anxiety that people who are not familiar with using cannabis encounter when they try THC. Sometimes a naive user for the first time gets very panicky, especially with higher doses. And it could be quite an upsetting evening if you're going to a party and you don't think that you've ever tried something before, a co-ed having a cookie or something that she doesn't know maybe has enough THC in it. For the first time user, that can be unpleasant. So cannabis, as far as a whole flower, a whole balanced plant, evolved with balances between CBD and THC that mitigates many of the anxiety-ridden side effects of THC that you would see through Marinol. So evidence-based data is conclusive for nausea and vomiting. It's also conclusive for CBD's use, cannabidiole's use, not for anxiety, but for the seizures that rarely happen to kids from a few particular types of diseases where traditional medicines for seizures don't work. And I'm not saying you shouldn't first go for the traditional meds, but for those refractory cases, CBD is shown and came out of federal prohibition. It was actually a few years ago, went from Schedule 1, along with all the other cannabis chemicals, to Schedule 5, the least controlled, but within a year later went right to being unscheduled. So CBD being unscheduled is, as I said, what promulgated most of these farmers to want to grow it all over the country is the new wonder drug. If you're a kid with those intractable seizures and that's all that works, it is your wonder drug. But that's conclusive evidence-based data. There is, though, substantial evidence-based data for the pain associated with muscle spasms that come from multiple sclerosis. MS, about 90% of patients will have at some course in their illness intractable muscle spasms, and there is substantial evidence-based data that it works for that. And I'll give you a fourth thing that has substantial evidence-based data, because this is the one that's probably poorest understood. There's substantial evidence-based data for the use of cannabis, in particular THC, for the management of chronic pain. And I'm saying it that way because of being controversial and because I'm a fellowship-trained anesthesiologist in pain management. That's why I was very careful to point out that not all pain is physical. I believe many patients who use cannabis for pain equate pain with what it really is. It's not a diagnosis. Pain is a symptom of many diseases and injuries, and as such, pain is really an intolerable symptom. So if pain is an intolerable symptom, please recognize that pain, for the reasons that patients use cannabis, can also have a psychologically intolerable symptom, or if you know people who can be spiritually so upset with something that it is intolerable, those patients seem to also gravitate towards and find great relief with cannabinoids used as medicines. So there is substantial evidence-based data for its use in chronic pain, but that's not all pain. That's just those particular patients and how I believe they are using it therapeutically. Does that answer most of what you were looking for, Bill?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Any other chat questions or things? I'm available to you, and we're not even at an hour yet. I'm kind of tearing through this. How long is our talks usually, or the dialogue?
Hour and a half, unless Dr. Halas is around, then we could be here till the next morning if we let him.
Anyway, I think the most exciting thing that I wanted to speak with your group about, besides some of the advices and warnings about Delta 8, is the fact that this next year may be the year that cannabis comes out of its federal prohibition. And you know what? It's kind of an interesting amount of years since it went into it. Remember, we said 1970, Bill?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the fact is, the first state, though, that took it out of prohibition was really California. And they did so shortly after Professor Mishulam identified the mechanism of action. So by the mid-1990s, I think it's 96, is that right, Kent? You're California, you would know this. Cannabis made it legal for medical use. I mean, California made it legal for medical use.
1996.
If you look actually at cannabis going into prohibition, it actually happened 1910, 1911. And strangely enough, the first state that put it into prohibition was also California. And because you had some states in the desert Southwest that none other than Pancho Villa, with vigilantes coming from Mexico, but not being the Mexican government. Remember, he was not associated with the Mexican government, but wanted to take back over land taken or from wars. He basically entered the United States, killed some American citizens, took over land. And so that really, in fact, if you want to look at the first real terrorist attack on US soil, and I'm emphasizing on US soil, it might very well have been Pancho Villa, not the World Trade Center. So that was in 1910-11. By 1937, about 27 years or so, now the popular craze across the country was we have to outlaw cannabis because it's associated with deviants and terrorists and all the other subversive rhetoric that goes along with cannabis back in those days. Well, if that's a little over a quarter century, Bill, I'm thinking that from 1996 till now is a little over a quarter century, maybe in the time that the process brings it out of prohibition. My point being, it's a process. It's not really a moment in time, but when it does officially come out of prohibition, and it may be sooner than you think, that's when the real floodgates open. That's when big pharma comes to this. Right now, they've stayed a healthy arm's length away because they know they'd be breaking the law themselves. So it's not just the big business of interstate banking and commerce from those companies in business for it. It's big pharma and what they'd like to see. Will that do away with the dispensary model? Will you see it in your local CVS and Walgreens and things like that? Maybe in some way, shape, or form. I can't really imagine that smoking is going to be coming up, but I do know that vaping or vaporizing mitigates some of the lung problems, but vaping, if you remember too, had an ugly side with cannabis right before COVID. Anybody remember in late 2019, kids were vaping contaminated oils, not just vape oils, but ones that had additives put into it, and they were very harmful to lungs. Ventilators.
Well, they were using diluents because they had gotten extraction so good, so they could get very high well over 90%, which was difficult to run through a vape. So they had to dilute it. And these ignorant people thought, well, vitamin E's healthy for you. Let's stick that in there.
Vitamin E acetate is something
Right.
in the popcorn industry too.
It was horrible.
It really destroyed many young kids' lungs. And
Low
that was
molecular
actually
weight
purely
polyethylene glycol, all kinds of things were used, which were very toxic.
So if I'm going to make an analogy to what Kent's saying about additives, you can go back to the 1920s and think a minute about alcohol's prohibition when people are cutting booze, because the fact that Kent's saying it's so concentrated, the oil, that's one of the side effects of prohibition itself.
Yeah.
Remember, the penalties if you get caught, whether with alcohol or with cannabis when they're prohibited, are based on how much you're getting, what's the weight of what you're carrying. So in that sense, then nobody is selling beer or wine during alcohol's prohibition. Al Capone is rum running, and it's about moonshine. And the same thing is to today's cannabis is sort of the moonshine equivalent, and grown with the same stills and hills mentality by illegal sources. But the hills are no longer Appalachia. It might be the Colorado Mountain, Rockies there, Bill. But you can tell me that. I'm bringing up the analogies of prohibition, concentrates, and diluting them, because many people died from having not just grain alcohol, but ethyl versus methyl.
Right.
And so the same players in a sense, but the same consequences of its prohibition and an illegal market would go away with the repeal of prohibition. And I think that immediately happened with alcohol's prohibition, and companies like Seagram's that didn't reluctantly stamp their feet or hold up a XXX jug with a toothless grin like somebody from Appalachia might have. They embraced the opportunity to do it legally in a liquor store under federal guidelines, and Seagram's is still in business today. So I see this as being a step in the right direction, perhaps divisive for many in industry now who are exploiting its illegality. How do you tell somebody who has had an illegal grow for years that now, because it's legal, they have to install handicap ramps getting in and out of their grow? I mean, they're going to say, what? Yeah. So these are going to be the rollout. It's not going to happen instantly, but I do think it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, a lot of those things are sort of like, don't ask for some things that you might get it. So I gave a talk to a group of chiropractors over the weekend, and if you'll recall, there was a big push for them to be for insurance companies to pay for them. Well, now they do. Now they don't want it. So it's the same thing. And
limits that way. And
you missed one of the great sort of icons of cannabis prohibition, and that was the movie Reefer Madness.
I used to have slides that I showed from that, and that was part of a campaign, and scare campaigns, fear mongering, misinformation. It's all part of the political process. The
which
politics
drove
for this for me is,
which drove to the, the international interface and control and the single convention. And that's one of the things that they actually have to dismantle for, we forced it on the rest of the, world.
And the rest of the world is waiting for us to come out. The World Health Organization, like you said, the United Nations Convention, those are things that would happen right in line like dominoes after federal prohibition by the Controlled Substances Act gets
Right.
reconsidered. So this is really, I believe, going to be a sentinel moment. I can't guarantee it. A lot of people had thought this would happen before, but I haven't seen yet one particular White House administration come in and advance it this way with this much evidence-based data. And by the way, that National Academy's meta-analysis report I told you about from early 2017, that's a federally commissioned study. This is not like, somebody else doing it and saying, oh, believe our data. It's very real. And in that sense, perhaps the thing for those on the call not to do is please don't think that just because in your given state, cannabis can be authorized for a patient because of 50 different qualifying conditions. The 4 that I mentioned before, nausea, vomiting, chronic pain, muscle spasms, and seizures, are those that I would focus on if you have patients who really want to know about it. I will tell you one more thing about one of the things that is legal, and I'm sure any of your states now, it's its use for glaucoma. I have glaucoma. I've had problems with my left eye and retinal detachments, and all I can tell you is glaucoma is recognized as eye pressures go down when people smoke reefer, but it stays down only for a short period of time compared to eye drops. And because glaucoma can happen from several different mechanisms, the end result being high pressure, there are so many different better treatments for glaucoma than cannabis. Just because it might be legal in your state to get a patient reefer because they have glaucoma doesn't mean you're practicing good medicine. And that's my message here. You still have to compare the other advances in medicine and what's happened in the last 50 years under cannabis's prohibition to assess its efficacy and safety today compared to what else is available. That's about all I think I have to say, unless other questions come up, Bill.
The question is Delta 8 available in dispensaries? And can you get it as a gummy, as an oil? How does it come?
Yes, yes, and yes. Kent, you want to talk about that one here? I mean, the fact is Delta 8 is a typical designer drug. By the definition, a designer drug is something that's created to stay one step ahead of the law.
Yeah.
And that in this case, it's a gray market designer drug. So while you can get it, my caution to you is, why would you want to get it if you can get Delta 9 in the same dispensary? The problem is the labeling, because the things that you get, especially outside of a controlled dispensary, if it has, I say controlled in the sense that it would have regulations in the state in which that dispensary is operating. There are no guardrails for where you could sell it if it's Delta 8 in a state where, like I said, it doesn't matter how old you are if you want to go buy it or who can sell it. The problem is most times, and this has been looked at critically, it's not telling you necessarily how much is in there, nor what to expect with it other than, hey, I can get high on this like I could also with Delta 9. Remember this also, that if you're going to buy cannabis for a medical use, the taxation's not there. You may pay a doctor for a visit, but hopefully that ensures a better outcome, at least from a subjective physician's opinion. But you also have to deal with taxing on things when it becomes a legal market for adult use, we say. And if there's anything that's found out from the legal markets that way, is that if you tax it more than a certain amount, all that does is it keeps a perfectly vital black market still working in the community where somebody's used to getting it without paying that exorbitant tax. Here's the other thing. Kent brought up the concentration of things, but the abundance of cannabis in the United States is extraordinary. It's a weed. It's easy to grow. And so there is such an abundance that the actual price of the product literally goes down the toilet itself. So with the abundance of cannabis, then we've sort of gotten away from the Pericles dictum from toxicology, and that's that the dose sometimes defines a poison. Give you too much oxygen, give you too much water, I can kill you with either of those things. So if somebody is truly taking it for a medical reason, the lowest effective dose is where you normally stop. That's where that temptation, indulgence, smoke with the genie comes to play, because if you're going to tell that to some people who have just used it and are used to using it and still want to keep using it because it becomes part of their, and I'm going to say psyche, but part of their routine. Ritual, thank you. It's like a tobacco cigarette. The ritual sets the chemicals in motion, including dopamine. The smell of a tobacco cigarette, lighting it up. The rituals also exist with cannabis, including smoking. So when people were asking me as the vaping problems happened in late 2019, and they're starting to, bring up, oh, well, what about this vaping thing? Am I better off, not vaping and just having whole flower? And I'm thinking to myself, we're going into a pandemic of a respiratory disease, no vaccines. It's probably not the best time to take up smoking. But then again, people do what people do. And the intolerable symptoms are what I'm trying to point out. And I do believe that people use it when they hit that point. If it's physical, one thing, but psychological and spiritual use of cannabis is an extensive way that humans, and especially in the United States, seem to be using it regularly. It's so cheap to produce that even the drug cartels from Mexico are no longer bringing it in. They're coming in and they're taking it out of here because it's a better quality and it's cheaper here for them to move it in the opposite direction that it went for decades. So such is the nature of commerce and farming and all of this, but it's fascinating to me because I had a background in healthcare science and agricultural science, but it's the political science determining economics that I found to be my best learning curve over the last few years. And for me, that's fascinating because they don't teach that in medical school.
All right. Okay, I don't have any other questions in the chat. Anybody else have any questions for
Andy's been quiet.
Yeah, thanks for showing up, Dr. Block.
Hi, how are you?
Man, everything's good.
Wonderful.
All this stuff's very interesting. When we're talking about the legal medical cannabis, if you follow the rules that they have in the state, it would cost about $5,000 just to do a workup on a patient. So the doctors get $200 for giving the card. But if you did what's actually required by law, it would cost thousands of dollars just for the workup. And that includes the complete elimination of any possibility of any cancer in the patient. So who's going to do a workup like that?
Wow.
Different states have different obvious rules and regulations. Florida's, and I meet regularly with the doctors who are the authorizing physicians. I don't authorize patients to get it. I did do 10 years ago the mandated CMEs, there's CME talk again, that all those docs had to first pass before they could see patients. Then I was asked to rewrite the rules of Florida's laws as the only doc asked to do that. So 10 years ago, I sort of saw the way that different doctors, and we've got a big state like California where people in one north part of the state may be very different politically, practice-wise, culturally than another part. And so our state's also kind of a good example when I look at it, because when I gave a similar talk to the docs here, about the importance of it potentially coming out of federal prohibition. A few of the docs on the call said, oh, well, that can't be good. It has to be completely unregulated and descheduled, because if we go from a prohibited substance to a controlled substance, anytime the federal government controls anything, it's always bad. So that knee-jerk mentality among physicians in my state kind of made me take a step backwards and say, you don't think it would be better to have it legally prescribed, taught, banked, and researched because of the constraints of what prohibition Schedule I does to it and has done to it for the last 55 years? I think it's not such a baby step at all. It's a huge first step. And if that's a way that it leads to a further lower scheduling or descheduling in the future, so be it. But it's a very important step. And I would caution anybody who is used to seeing patients for cannabis who might be on this call into just doing business as usual, because when the federal government does come about to seeing this be rescheduled, along with it will come rules and regulations that you haven't had to deal with in the past. I'm not saying a cost basis, Andy. I'm talking about more of what you have to do to bring it up to a level like any other prescribed medicine, including educating on it. So I actually think that's a good thing.
If it becomes impossible to do what the state medically requires, that means those doctors who are ethical refuse to give the cards, while those that don't care at all are just saying, sign here, it's $200, see you later. So if it was actually trying to serve the best interest of the patient, it would be a different thing. And but this is the starting point. They never did anything before. So and in the state, they don't know what the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. So they're trying. So I commend that. But
I think what's going to happen over time, though, is that cannabis would be gradually, whether in terms of the chemicals that are extracted, whether through edibles, something putting on skin, under your tongue, like troche has with Ken, or absorbable things. Cannabis overall, I think, will be more mainstream in practice so that physicians regard it as one alternative of what they can use in a medical treatment regimen, not the only one. And right now, physicians who are so passionate about cannabis throughout the country, many of them have dropped their other practice and really only see patients for the purposes of providing cannabis care. I see that as being very narrow-minded. And I would love to see it work its way into formulary, as it would be. You measure one drug compared to another, one treatment modality against another. There are plenty of treatments for pain that have nothing to do with drugs whatsoever. And so bringing that basically within the armamentarium of a physician's formulary, I think, is really the big changes that will happen over time.
Hey, since you brought up troche, for those that don't know about troche, Ken Crowley on our board runs pretty much that whole business factory, research, everything. It's pretty impressive. So if people don't know about troche, TROKIE.com, I think.
Yeah.
That's where something like 90% of the benefit from cannabis can be found. You don't even have to go into the THC. So the high quality CBD that's, safe, clear and all that. So anyway, I highly recommend it. All of my patients, I recommend the troche because it's the simplest, safest, and probably the cheapest way I know to go. It's not a
And
cheap
I'm gonna add something to that for those on the call who want to know why it works. It's not only what the chemicals are in it, but we just talked a little while ago about how smoking has its own side effects, and this is all drugs getting in the body. So the fastest way to get the effects to the brain is probably right through the lungs, where the blood gets through the right heart, right up to the brain. And so when you consider why people smoke and traditionally have, or vape, it's a pulmonary route of delivery that makes it very quick to getting up to where people feel the difference. But if you were to have an edible, on the other hand, and actually ingest the chemicals, even balances of the chemicals, then it goes through a different metabolism. It actually takes at least half an hour, sometimes as long as an hour or more, to get in your system where you feel it. But what you're actually feeling very much is not simply the THC that is the intoxicating substance. Your liver metabolism converts it to hydroxy 11-THC, which is 4 times longer lasting and about 4 times more potent. So when you consider edibles, then that's a second way of getting it: smoking, ingestion. A third way might even be topical, but you'll be hard pressed to get enough in your full circulation and up to your brain by putting something in topically. Maybe good for around the bad joint or an inflammation joint or things. However, where troche hits a beautiful method of delivery is by vascular absorption. You absorb through your mouth. That's why nitroglycerin, you're having a heart attack, take it quick. It gets in there quick when it's taken in through the oral mucosa. And same thing with rectal suppositories. If somebody has intractable vomiting, chemotherapy, things, or just can't swallow, a suppository could be a wonderful way, because there's a lot of vascular absorption from that end of the GI tract too. So troche's brilliance then is by having a measured amount that can be absorbed reasonably fast, not as fast as smoking, but faster than by ingestion with the delay time. And you actually get a little closer to what you know you're getting, because it's generally not going through stuff that you swallow that may get into the ingestion and have liver metabolism, but staying where it's put so it gets absorbed over several minutes, not a few hours. And that I think is the brilliance of the formulary. Did I say that all right, Ken?
You did fabulous. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Another question for you, Jeff. What facilitates the munchies?
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, when you're talking about GI, and this is actually more of an advanced topic now because of things like Ozempic and Mounjaro, things like that. The gut's a very complex place, and Bill, you as a hormone guy would know this particularly well, but the munchies generally has been something that you think that when you have cannabis, that because it relieves nausea, that it establishes the flow in the correct direction, mouth out the rear. However, munchies and appetite is also part of context, number one, but it was probably the first observed use of cannabis when it was used in California through San Francisco for the earliest patients who were dying from AIDS, thin man disease. And Don Abrams was finding out that if he gave patients who had intractable vomiting from the diseases and associated problems with GI absorption that AIDS patients were getting, they were having their nausea squelched and maybe living with nutritional to see another day. It wasn't a cure for AIDS, but it was something which was absolutely, found to work there. And other research was part of the evidence-based data for why it now has conclusive evidence-based data that way. It stimulates appetite, which brings up the question for some of the side effects you see. Now, we talked about side effects, not giving it to kids because their neural connections aren't there until they're in their mid-20s. But a pregnant woman is not a good person to give it to also because the fetus is developing those same connections. But if you want to go even, one step further to looking at effects and side effects, there's something called hyperemesis syndrome, where some people, particularly people who tend to use more concentrated doses and use it regularly, instead of having nausea calmed, actually it's something that with the cannabis, they get intractable vomiting. The exact mechanism hasn't necessarily been clearly understood, but I can tell you, I had kidney stones years ago, and I found out that when I had renal colic, which is a big, colicky vagal stimulation, that I would go into the shower. Part of it is because I didn't want to make a mess because I was throwing up. And it sounds horrible, but for some reason, the warm showers help my nausea go away. That is almost a pathognomonic finding in people who come to emergency rooms with a history of cannabis use and intractable vomiting. They can get very sick, not just dehydrated, electrical disturbances and stuff.
Oh, serious, yeah.
So the counter side of appetite, helping appetite, Bill, is actually this. Could that be an autoimmune thing or some other mechanism? Not as well understood as you need to, but you go to any ER now that cannabis is so popular throughout the country and ask the ER docs about patients coming in with hyperemesis syndrome. Happens a lot, much more than you'd think. Now, I'm going to give you an exception to something about nausea and vomiting, but where appetite's very important. And remember, I said a little while ago, it wasn't a good idea to give cannabis to a pregnant woman because of the fetus development. Well, there may be a good exception to that. I'm going to tell you that I have a good feel for other cultures. My wife is Jamaican, and she asked if I would want to go down to Jamaica and actually talk to 3 groups. They have doctors and nurses. Obviously, they come up here to the States very often and practice medicine, but a 3rd group called plant practitioners, which are herbalists. And if you don't have access to the definitive healthcare for somebody to go in to that fancy emergency room, get an IV to restore fluids, and maybe give you some Zofran so that your nausea goes away, an herbalist would give a woman in their first trimester of pregnancy with intractable vomiting, where they can lose the baby, they would give them steeped teas using cannabis leaves, very dilute, not a lot of getting you high in that, but it's restoring volume and it's taking advantage of cannabis for its antiemetic effects. Appetite, giving you more of an appetite, not long-term, not for the whole pregnancy, just to get past that sensitive first trimester time that actually a lot of women get. And if you didn't have a way to advance healthcare in a way that we're used to here in the States, that's a traditional way that cannabis is used. Low dose, brief treatment, specific indication, and generally a good outcome. If you look at what are called APGAR scores on the babies of Rastafarian women,
Yeah.
they're off the charts. I mean, these are bouncing, babies of good weight and vitality. And so there's a good example of a cultural use of it from a peoples that have known about it for use versus abuse. Where, by the way, people don't know this, but cannabis is absolutely still illegal in Jamaica. Don't let the Bob Marley 9 Mile thing and all the marketing for tourism fool you. They have the British school system where school is mandatory. Kids all are in their uniforms. You got to go to school. They protect their kids, and they are very much afraid of cannabis getting out there in their children, as we should be. So hopefully that analogy to.
Yeah, that was a great analogy, Jeff.
Okay, great.
Can I say a couple of things real quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, hi.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dr. Block. Excellent presentation. I'm coming to you as a pharmacist and as a current owner of an R&D cannabis manufacturing company. First, as far as that goes, with Delta 8, I think we're all totally, or at least 90% against that. Delta 9 THC, we've been doing safety studies on that for 4,000 years, and we can all say it's pretty safe. Delta 8, as you say, is a designer drug. I would not recommend to anybody. First of all, to reach an intoxicated state, it takes more than Delta 8. And then plus, I've been hearing about some adverse effects, including some cardiac stuff. So I definitely stay away from that. The pharmacist in me says, have they thought through this entire process of scheduling this as Schedule 3? Where will the supply come from? I don't think our regular wholesalers are going to carry this. As you know, there are different cultivars because there's over 100 different cannabinoids in this plant. So who's to say which ones are for which? Are you going to have to go into a pharmacy to get a controlled substance, which you do now? I don't think we're going to get those in dispensaries or gas stations. So now you have to deal with all the logistics of that and then all of the paperwork, as we all know, with controlled substances. This is a monster. If somebody really wants to tackle this, I say, good luck. I like the thought and the idea, but I'm not sure it was completely thought through. University of Mississippi is not going to be able to supply all of this.
Since when does political regulators ever think anything through?
Good point. I don't know what I was thinking.
Well, Bob or Robert, the fact is, when I'm looking at coming out of prohibition and where it'll be, I just had a train of thought. I'm just losing there a moment when you're talking about the last part about, fitting wear. Cannabis, as I said before, when I talked about the Controlled Substances Act being something that works with one molecule, one disease, and one patent, cannabis is not one molecule.
Exactly.
And the only analogy I gave was when I talked about how CBD mitigates some of the side effects of THC as an anxiolytic versus something that will make some people panicky on their own if they're a naive user in particular. So when you start having not 100 cannabinoids, but look, you've got probably about half a dozen key cannabinoids and maybe about that many terpenoids too.
Yeah.
So once you have 12 variables, according to the FDA and guidelines of how you have to research each one independently and then different combinations of ones put together, it makes what the Controlled Substance Act does is it makes studying something like cannabis exponentially more challenging because of how many active chemicals are working as an ensemble. There's some people who like to use the word entourage effect when you take cannabinoids and you put them with the terpenes
and esters.
Entourage. I actually had this discussion with Professor Meshulam because he's one of the ones who didn't coin the word, but they discussed it. I tend to be a little musical in terms of having grown up playing woodwinds, and I really see it more that cannabis is more of an ensemble effect where too much expression from one instrument versus another, and you don't have a full balanced orchestration. Or entourage generally means that THC is the soloist and everything else is chasing it. I don't think that that's necessarily the way to look forward to what different cannabinoids could do alone or in combination with terpenes.
What's interesting that there was a couple day half-day symposium over 2 days that the Center for Medical Cannabis Research, which is based at UCSD, presented some just fascinating research looking at looking at the different physiologically active components, whether they're major and minor cannabinoids, like combining CBD and CBN together or separate to improve sleep, for instance. And they found that CBD actually lowered the quality that CBN generated on its own. They talked about some terpene interactions as well. And so some of the things that we just sit back and think, oh, this seems logical, are actually now being shown to either be beneficial or actually not beneficial for the symptom that so many people are commonly using phytocannabinoids and terpenes for.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. I think
In November, that actually the recordings from that presentation are going to be available. And if you guys want to know, I'll put it on the chat. It's the CMCR website, which is cmcr.us or ucsb.edu. And so you can go to that site in probably latter part of November, and they'll have those 2 days of presentations, just fascinating new information, some pre-publish. They're in the middle of the studies, but great new stuff.
That sounds great. Thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm going to give one more comment about potency a minute. We talked about it a little bit in the terms of the toxicology, the lowest effective dose, but because I think there's people on this call who range in age, I don't know if we have any 20-somethings here, but looks like we have some people with gray hair. And today's pot is not your father's or your grandfather's pot. And it's because of what prohibition itself has done. When I said before that it produces things that are more concentrated, what happened is in 1973, Richard Evans Schultes, who is the famed Harvard ethnobotanist, discovered a plant, basically what's been named since is Afghani Kush #1. It's in Kandahar. And that is a very harsh environment, 8,000-foot plateaus, a lot of UV light, really not very good soils. And yet this plant, which is a weed, is growing there. And that particular plant of Afghani Kush #1 has a lot of THC, a lot of a terpene called myrcene, and it's a 4 to 5 foot squatty plant. Well, this is 1973, shortly after the Controlled Substance Act. So that became the breeding darling plant with dominant genetics that virtually everything you see in the stores today are progeny of. So, why is it everything there? Well, mostly because of the last thing I said about the plant. It's a 4 to 5 foot squatty plant. And in the early 70s, if you were going to take a risk on growing this, it's easy to hide from a helicopter because hemp is a 20-foot plant in one growing season. So all of these things coming together changed the concentrations of cannabis over the next 50 years to be as potent as it is today because of those dominant genetics. Where do I plan to be? Hopefully a year from now. Florida's been slow to awarding licenses for new companies, but if I were a Florida licensed, I am a Florida licensed physician. I've been that for 40 years. But if I wanted to work with the plant directly, which is what I do, I breed tropical ornamentals and I've bred a lot of plants. I couldn't do it as a certifying doc in Florida. I only could do it if I were the medical director, as is required by Florida law, of one of the licensed companies. So I expect that before the end of the year, new applications that went in this past April will be awarded. And I would hope that if by this time next year that license gets awarded and I'm the medical director of one of the companies here in my own backyard, I would love to rehybridize or reverse engineer, however you want to call it, maybe more heirloom plants that had a better balance of certain chemicals, that it's not only about getting high in potency anymore. It's the way humans evolved with cannabis for most of the recorded 6,000 years, not the last 60.
One more question here. Why is ganja in Jamaica called the weed of wisdom?
A good question. I don't have the exact answer to that, but I would think it sort of comes from that Rastafarian sort of worshiping of it. It is a religious experience and sacrament that there is a very different cultural acceptance. And that's not all Jamaica. I'm just talking about Rasta.
Okay, I'm just reading you the questions here. That's all.
Okay, well, I don't know. A good fun fact question for the
John,
next.
how about you? You got the answer to that one, John? No,
Andy, you're going to ask us about
I don't.
weed of wisdom.
Yeah, Andy,
You know what? But let me. I'm gonna take a stab at it from a different angle. Wisdom and creative thought. So a lot of creative thought leads to what people regard as wisdom because you figure things out. Well, again, some real good research coming out of Stanford in particular, in California, looks at the creativity that some people get from cannabis, such that musicians, artists, things like that. Not that that's equatable to wisdom, but certainly some people do it in a creative way. And what cannabis seems to do for the brain involves something called divergent versus convergent thought. Divergent thought being the first stuff, you throw ideas out there, see what sticks, and then as you're looking at it, the convergent part is, well, if we pick this and we put it with that and this, now we've got a new way of putting the pieces together to where that makes sense. And that's wisdom, maybe. I know in creativity, then, dopamine levels follow that divergent and convergent thought with, ebbing and flowing. So I don't know exactly where the saying in Jamaica comes from, but I think it's a fascinating neurobiological chemistry talk, because cannabinoids have influence on all other receptor systems, including those involving dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, those three chemicals I've just mentioned in combination in the midbrain, and all of the effects it has to mood, wisdom, insight, and maybe even that sixth sense that people feel, but they can't put a finger on it. It's not like touch or taste or smell or, hearing, sight. It's that sixth sense that people sometimes connect to fleetingly. But I do think it involves cannabinoids and those principal three neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, for why we're human. And that's just a little comment on wisdom.
Great. Okay. Anybody, anything else? Comments?
Oh, great.
I would
Great
like to, hi, I would like to put a plug in for the troche, the creams, the anagelic creams of your product, Dr. Crowley. Work very, very well for pain.
Thanks.
Do you still have them?
They were developed with a colleague of mine, and they are available, just not under the Troche brand. So
Okay,
if you do want them, I can link you with Willow Springs, and they can take care of it. Just, the herbs are grown on site there. It's just a fabulous product.
it really is. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Kent, you want to put in, and Dr. Block, if you want to put in the chat how we can get in touch with you?
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm going to put my email down here. Let's see. And thank you for reading the comments. When I'm giving a talk, it's like impossible to do that at the same time.
I know, I have the same issue.
How do I send it to everybody? Who
All
can
the way
see
at the
it?
top.
Just
At the top. Thank you.
All the way to the top,
Uh,
to everybody.
It should say to everyone. It's a drop down under the chat.
yeah, I'm looking, but I see. Oh, everyone in meeting. Thank you. Gotcha. Okay. My email is Doc Block, easy moniker there. My company name is Nurturing Nature, which strangely enough is actually what cannabinoids do, even though I had that name from before knowing cannabis. And I'm gonna put down my direct phone if anybody wants to. Sometimes a quick call is better, just because it takes a lot of time for my fingers to text messages and things like that. So I've enjoyed speaking with you folks again.
Thank you.
I
Don't
do
be
regard you, I do regard you osteopaths as my colleagues, but perhaps a bit more wise. Florida only recognizes MDs and DOs in the cannabis space. We do not recognize naturopaths, and many states do. And they have a much more extensive knowledge of plants, of course. Homeopaths, of course, are not recognized here either. But depending on which state you look at for which physicians are in this space, naturopaths do have a big influence, not only here, but in Canada, where it's been legal, including recreationally, for a while now. Health Canada publishes on cannabis, and you should look at that because it's what has not yet come out from our FDA and federal government, but it'll give you a better balance of supporting data, literature, and the experiences, at least of our neighboring country to the north. Health Canada, it's called.
Okay, great. Okay, next week, Dr. Patel is going to give us some insight on how to approach patients from an environmental standpoint. So she does environmental medicine, and some of us are do get a little bit lost, you know, in that space. So she's going to give us the how-to on how to do that. So that's next week. And like I said, if you're in the Houston area tomorrow, over the weekend, I'll be speaking at the Age Management Medical Group, agemed.org. And they're a nice group. It's not so big like A4M. It's a lot more intimate, and we usually do have some pretty good sessions there. So if you're interested in that, here, let me put that. They still haven't come out of the 8th century, though. I try to get them to do live streaming too, and they insist on not doing that. So, but that's that. What can I tell you? So, so everybody, thank you, Dr. Block. Thank you so much again. Don't be such a stranger. We always enjoy hearing from you, and you're always up on the latest. And again, on the email that I sent, inviting you to this, I've been putting little videos and whatnot of our speakers all, and Dr. Block is like a master gardener, and you can explain what that video was. And you have all sorts of ones on YouTube. Just put in Dr. Block gardening. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, it's just unreal. Your thumb, your green thumb.
His garden is actually a destination. It is, he has such a fabulous property with such a fascinating story attached to it.
I've been doing this my whole life. My garden is a member garden of the American Public Gardens Association, but I raise my family here, so I'm not public the way that many public gardens really are. But I do make it a point to share it with people who are interested. Bill, when you come back to Florida, if you don't call me next time, I'm not going to invite you again. but you guys come running through, you stop in Miami, and I'm only 20 minutes from the airport, but anybody who would like to see it, if you're around, give me a call. And if we can coordinate schedules that way, I'm happy to show it to you. Only legal plants here, but I'd say that they're growing to as high of a horticultural standard as many other botanical gardens that are better recognized because of their names. But it's sort of what I like to do, and it's a hobby interest. I've been in the same place for 35 years, and it's a 110-year-old avocado and mango grove that's endured South Florida's hurricanes for that time. So
don't you have a mango tree that's registered as the largest?
Yeah, the federal government, the Division of Forestry, has a list of the champion trees. They're called national champion trees. So what is the sequoia, the General Sherman tree or something? And some of these have names, but yeah, the largest mango in the United States is in my backyard. And like I said, it started as a grove back in 1916. But by 1926, it was replatted for residential. That's when Miami really was having its roaring 20s boom. And it was replatted. And then in mid-1926, we had the Great Miami Hurricane, which pretty much put us off the map due to the depression that followed, and then World War II. So it wasn't until the mid-1950s that Miami started coming back. If I said the name Jackie Gleason or the Rat Pack,
That's exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, the Rat Pack. That's when my grandmother was recognized here. She did the original interior to a hotel here when it was built, called the Fontainebleau Hotel. And so it gives you, it's not just me, it's my family and who I learned plants through, which was my Nana back then. And I still have the key to the city of Miami Beach for that. I don't know, we've got some fancy restaurants here like Joe's Stone Crab. And before my family moved me here as a 14-year-old, which was cruel, in 1969, I moved here. No 14-year-old wants to move. I don't care where you live. But when we would come down here and we would go to like a fancy restaurant while we're visiting Nana, she'd whip out this key and show it to the maitre d'. Come on in, man, like we're big shots. We weren't. She just had this special key that I still have, and it doesn't get me in anywhere. It's just a relic. But yeah, I've been doing it a long time in the same place, and my blood's thin. I don't like traveling to where it gets too cold anymore.
Thank you, Dr. Block. Your video, I watched it a little bit. Your garden is just gorgeous, beautiful.
Well, thank you. Bill gave a link to the second of 2 episodes. The first one, actually, these were both filmed in January. And there's now you have social plant influencers, okay? And so this lady who does this used to be an eco model. Well, she advertised herself as an eco model. She's about 40 years old now, but when she went into this, she's 5'10", and then I'm going to say this as politely as I know. She's a babe, and she was when she was 20 years old. What she didn't tell people, she's also a degreed entomologist from Cornell. So she does know what she's talking about. And she's very good with interviews and how she markets this. But the first of the 2 episodes, not the one Bill linked to, the first one is episode 301. The series that she does is called Plant One on Me. A great one for a lady who's, a model. But Plant One on Me is her series of things. And the first episode that was filmed in January on Last Look, it's been viewed worldwide close to 400,000 times already,
Wow.
which is starting to get into that viral word, I hear about for social influence. So it's kind of cool because people never knew me as an anesthesiologist. Now I'm a face out there in the plant world, but anesthesiologists, they put us in an operating room with locked floors. They put a mask on us and there's no windows, so nobody knows who the hell I am when I'm doing that. The plant world is a very different profile, and it's kind of cool. But
I'll see if I can find the link. I'll put it on next week's email. I'll put that
episode 301. That's the
Got
one that's gotten more of the following than the one that you posted.
I always try to I've been trying to put on a little video of whoever the speaker is, but I'll put that one on too, because I didn't know it was part 2. So
You've been doing a really good job on that, Dr. Bill. Fabulous work.
thank you. Yeah. So yeah.
It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work when you did it years ago.
Once I got the AOA's anger out of me, we went back to
How far back does that? How many years has it been since I spoke with you guys last?
I think it was 2020.
2020. Okay. Well, I missed you. Thank you for remembering me and inviting me back. And if I do come up with any cultivars for cannabis in the future that are heirloom, anybody ever taste like an heirloom fruit, a strawberry, tomato, things like that?
Grown.
I don't know how you'd compare an heirloom joint to what you may remember as a kid, but it's not always about getting high. It's part of the overall health and wellness. And I think that health and wellness, whether you're talking about botanical medicines or the hobby of gardening, a lot of people use this to stay engaged with nature, their backyard, because it doesn't take all that much thought, but you're doing something, you're moving around, you're interacting with nature and the world. For people who get in trouble with cannabis, who are the couch potatoes, who sit around and get the munchies and just eat in their parents' bedroom at age 40 years old, and there are plenty of them out there, that's sort of what you'd caution yourself with having some of the more modern cultivars, which are really all about THC. Myrcene, I told you, was what that particular, and I'm going to give one last comment about myrcene. I mentioned that is what was in that 1973 plant that was discovered in Kandahar. Lots of myrcene and lots of THC, which were the dominant genetics. Myrcene is a terpene. Terpenes are those chemicals that give all plants their smells. And believe me, if you ever watch somebody in a dispensary go through different canisters of cannabis, they'll take the lid off, put their nose in it, take a sniff. If it doesn't agree with them, they're not going to go for it. And there's some smells that when people smell, they say, I want that. There's some called diesel, okay? Why somebody would be attracted to diesel smell, I don't know, but that's the way we're wired. Myrcene, when people smell it and it gets brought in through olfactory, is not simply like lavender, which is calming and relaxing. That's why it's in bath soaps, or different smells are known to be arousing, like lemon fresh things in the grocery aisle give you a sense of being clean and awake. That's why they give it to you on your towel when you're finishing your flight, so you clean up. But myrcene is not simply relaxing, sedating, or calming. Myrcene is actually hypnotic. And an anesthesiologist knows a hypnotic patient when he sees one. The reason that hypnotic's important is that it also has more memory impairment. So when you couple THC, which is known to impair memory, with myrcene, there at least should be more memory impairment. If you want to see myrcene alone, a la carte, all you got to do is, even today, you can go to Bavaria, where myrcene is the most prevalent terpene in hops. Hops genetically is the closest plant to marijuana, to cannabis. And you can go to Bavaria today and get pillows stuffed with hops as a sleep aid. So what I'm sharing with you are the ways, and we didn't go into this on this talk. If people are interested, we can engage again. But smells play a lot to do with attitude, how you feel about something, and couple all of those chemicals with all of the cannabinoids and try to make sense of it to have it FDA approved for that reason. Good luck. That's why most of the emphasis for that 2018 Farm Bill was to try to have cannabis and its chemicals considered not as a pharmaceutical, but as a nutraceutical, which has a much lower threshold of scrutiny that it has to pass. So this is just the way that the cannabis plant has evolved over the last several years, 2018 only being 5 years ago. It's accelerating. I'm most excited about it coming out of federal prohibition, wherever it lands. Just get it out of prohibition.
Yeah.
Great. Okay,
Well, thanks so much, guys.
okay. Okay, next week we'll have Dr. Patel. John, you got anything for us?
Everything's good. I sent you a message on the school and how we can do some stuff, so.
All right,
Back in-
everybody else, thank you for.
Oh, the deers don't eat. I got one last question. Hi, Marie. Can I talk about that a second? Interesting. Any plants that deer don't eat, especially beautiful plants, they love all the vegetables. Sometimes in order to understand animals, whether humans and plants, you got to start to think like a plant. And I know that sounds bizarre, and no, I'm not smoking anything now, but what I'm pointing out is that the plant's chemistry is purposeful. The plants have had a lot longer to develop a sophisticated chemistry. And the Human Genome Project in year 2000 was followed in 2003 by the first plant genome called mouse crust, a little weedy kind of plant. But the reason I'm bringing up this relative to deers and what animals eat, we're mammals, and deer's a mammal. We have mammalian brains with the way we recall things, hippocampus, amygdalas. And it's interesting because if you start to think about cannabis from the plant and the animal's perspective, and you wonder why cannabis, which has been around for 60 million years, and humans only maybe for the last several 100,000, why would the plant have held on to THC for all of those millennia? And if I were a plant, and let's not say maybe a goat, Marie, but what about if, not a deer, but a goat? What about if a goat comes along and you got a little cannabis field going there, and some goats come by and they eat half the field? How smart of it is the plant, knowing the memory impairment that THC brings mammal brains, on maybe having the animals forget where that field was the next day so it doesn't come back and finish them off? That's the way you think like a plant, but look, this is teleology. I can't prove this. This is not for a PhD thesis, but sometimes you just got to look at it for what it is and wonder why.
Got it.
They just love all my flowering plants.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you
Except
what,
the one
most
that's like
botanical
marijuana.
medicines is alkaloids taste bitter, and the plants do that to discourage animals from eating them. Animals don't like bitter tastes
Oh,
either.
roses must taste beautiful, wonderful.
Perhaps.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Block. Thank you, everybody,
Signing off.
for staying so late. And I'll have this up as soon as I can. Next week, same time, same station, Dr. Patel. The week after that, we're going to have a special guest, and I'll let you know about that. That's Halloween night, unfortunately. And after that, the week after that, I got Jay, what's his name? The peptide guy.
Campbell.
Campbell, yeah, Jay Campbell. He's going to give us the latest. As you know, we got some great news on peptides in the last 2 weeks. So,
Dr. Bill, have we decided on doing a conference or not?
stay tuned. We might have had a breakthrough. So just give me another.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Bill.
Good night. It's good seeing you. Good seeing everybody. And thank you for all being here so late,
Good night.
everybody.